Before leaving Phnom Penh, I discovered a whole new way for me to dice with death. There was a mob-run casino on board a rather nice boat in the middle of the wide river that runs through the city. After a few hours of hasty research, I was at the tables, and a few hours later, I was being forcibly dragged from the casino and thrown off the boat into the river. I'm sorry, but if you're stupid enough to run a single-deck blackjack game in this day and age, you've got to expect somebody to be card-counting. But in fairness, they were awfully nice about it. They didn't take all the cash from me, and they were nice enough to throw my hat into the river after me. So, soaking wet and a rather large fistful of dollars heavier, I made my way back to my hotel for a change of clothes, and decided to brush up on my local history at the understated but nonetheless beautiful National Museum. I arrived shortly before sunset, and it was well into dusk as I was about to leave. It should have been some indication to me to get out of the way when the staff started taking cover behind the lobby counter. But still, slightly jet-lagged as I was, I just stood there in shock as the air was suddenly filled with thousands of bats, swarming up from the basement stairwell in the centre of the room. I spent several minutes just surrounded by thousands of pairs of flapping leathery wings before they all poured out into the night sky to the building's central courtyard. Not wanting to upset the adorable curt bats, but as cute as they are, sometimes it seems that bats as a species take it upon themselves to just freak me out. But I digress. The next day, I visited the Royal Palace before heading to the airport to requisition a pilot to fly me out of the city. It is truly amazing to see. On one side of the gates, you have beautiful buildings with gilded rooftops, a treasure house, the floor paved with pure silver, huge gold statues encrusted with immensely valuable jewels and ornamental swords, finely woven rugs from all over the Orient, and yet on the other side of the gates lies an entire city in the grips of despair, struggling to get back on its feet after a war that was fought more than 20 years ago. And yet, despite this staggering inequality, the people still seem immensely proud of the palace and the royal family. It's interesting to see. Still pondering this paradox, I made my way to the airport to find the only pilot that was still flying to the northern city of Siem Reap in any decent time. The plane was like something straight out of Raiders of the Lost Ark, complete with wooden crates full of squawking chickens and rolling watermelons. The sort of flying death trap that should have been taken out of service in the 1930s. The flight was terrifying, and the landing was the most horrifying and spectacular I've ever been in. The plane eventually came to a halt, sliding sideways, inches away from the terminal building. I needed a few dozen martinis after that, I can tell you. There's something wonderful about these run-down Asian cities, in that they never seem to sleep. The day is dedicated to the work and toil under the blistering sun, while the night seems full of all social activities and hubbub that it's too hot to deal with under the glare of the day. There never seems to be any lull or rest from the buzz of activity. These are places that are human in the extreme. I somewhat shakily made my way through this particular city to my new hotel, where I was to await the arrival of the Indian students. They weren't due for a few days yet, and in the meantime, I had a whole new and exciting city to explore. I passed some of my time in Siem Reap, wandering through the street markets and bars, but most of my time was spent outside the city itself, exploring the Angkor temples that are open to the public and talking with the villagers and small outlying villages there. After a week, I was joined by the university party. We gathered our guides and headed out off into the jungle. We spent the better part of 2 days trekking through the thick foliage, occasionally slowed down by various obstacles. Let me tell you, no amount of coffee in the world can snap you awake in the morning, quite like having your path blocked by a sign proudly displaying the legend, Minefield. One morning, however, our path was crossed by several armed men, drug runners by all accounts. We were forced onto our knees and held at gunpoint, while our group leader and one of the guides desperately negotiated with the men. After I don't know how long, Our leader came back and told us we were to hand over any money or valuables we had on our persons, and then would be allowed to go. We all promptly complied, but before allowing us up, one of the men with guns, apparently to make an example of the rest of us, took one of our guides in front of us and executed him. Needless to say, it was in a state of utter shock and horror that we pressed on. We left our leader and one of our remaining guides to deal with our now departed companion as we made our way onto the temple. We persevered as best we could, spending several days at the ruined jungle-covered temple. It was my job to climb in first and clear any plants away with the others to get a good look at what was there. A somewhat dangerous job, but one that allowed me to spend some much-needed time alone in contemplation with the jungle. Once we were done mapping and excavating, we returned to the city without incident, and I once again took to exploring the nearby towns and villages, finding some rather unusual ones, especially close to the country's vast lake. An entire village built on 10-meter-high poles so it could survive the annual flooding. But the strangest one of all I found was found right in the middle of the lake, built entirely on boats, and it was a proper fishing town with blacksmiths and pig farms, chicken coops, shops, schools, bars, everything. It was just north of this most unusual town, on top of a hill on the shores of the Great Lake, that I found myself in a Buddhist monastery. It was so wonderfully peaceful that it took me several weeks before I could bring myself to leave. But before I did, in an odd moment of charity, I donated the remainder of the money I'd won at the casino sometime earlier. In gratitude, the monks gave me a sword in the style of the ancient Khmer Empire. I'd seen similar things in the street markets, but it was most touching to be presented with one in such a way. After some debating with myself at the monastery, I decided to try and finally get home. So, I sold a few items to some street urchins, and bought myself passage on a very roundabout and not entirely legal route back home. A route that took in the wonders of Vietnam, Thailand, and China before finally landing me in Singapore some weeks later. I spent about a week in Singapore, mostly skulking in the dark corners of the amazingly atmospheric bar at the Raffles Hotel, before I finally got my flight back to London. I can honestly say that despite the death camps, the mass graves, the towers of human skulls, execution, being taken prisoner, getting mugged once or twice, and occasionally being fed roasted rats, Cambodia is one of the nicest countries I've ever been to. The general population are wonderfully friendly and accommodating. Not to mention, the Red Piano Bar in Siem Reap makes the finest cocktails available to humanity, bar none. Rather dangerous in places, but a true pleasure and a privilege to visit. Sadly, I can't quite say the same about the next country I found myself in.